Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Walking Festival of Sound 2022. It's a great pleasure to host an artist walk with Daniela O'Fee, who will be introduced soon by Tim Shaw, another curator of the Walking Festival of Sound. My name is Jacek Smolicki. And before moving on to the presentation and the screening, I just want to say a few words about the festival to those who are joining us first time. Walking Festival of Sound is a transdisciplinary event that aims to bring together people who are interested in and work with walking and listening as methods or techniques, either of research or communication, or basically curiosity, a form of curiosity, and attention to what surrounds us. And so far we've organized several of events, starting in 2019 in Stockholm, then Newcastle. In 2021, we moved to Krakow and Edinburgh, and this year we organized a joint event between two cities, which is like a kind of formula for the festival, and it's Seoul in Korea and Vancouver, or perhaps more broadly, British Columbia. So Daniela, who is joining us today, represents the BC kind of part of the festival. And just not to take too much time, I will tell a little bit about the schedule today. So we will have an introduction where Tim will tell you a few words about Daniela's activities as an artist and composer. And then Daniela will present her piece that will premiere within the Walking Festival of Sound later on in the form of a screening. And she will have about 10-15 minutes of the presentation. Then we will move to YouTube, where you will all be invited to watch the documentation from her soundwalk for about 20-23 minutes. And then we'll reconvene on Zoom, where we will have a discussion for another 15-20 minutes. And at the end, I will introduce and tell you some words about other pieces that have been premiered or are about to be premiered within this year's program. Just so you know, the event is being recorded, so if you wish so, please turn off your camera, but you're also welcome, of course, to keep it on. Just make sure that your microphones are off, and during the Q&A session, just as we do it each time, please post your questions and reflections in the chat, and we will read them out loud to Daniela. So again, thank you, Daniela, for joining us, and Tim, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Jacek. Thanks very much for that introduction. Yeah, a lot going on at the festival this year in two different places, but it's great to welcome Daniela to this event tonight, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the work and hearing Daniela talk firsthand about it as well. Just as an introduction for Daniela, I will read your bio. So Daniela O'Fee arrives at Soundscape Work after an extensive career in piano performance to retune her listening practice and reassess sound as a social and ecological resource. Studies in the areas of sculpture and intermedia at Thompson Rivers University further her late career investigation of wood bending and obsolete media, decommissioned musical instruments, field recording, extended piano techniques, and graphic scores. Her work, Tuning In, Tuning Out for Solo Listener, is included in the university's permanent art collection. Daniela holds a Bachelor of Music degree from the University of Victoria, where she was the winner of the school's concerto competition. She actively contributes to her local arts community in Kamloops, for which she earned the BC Culture Days Ambassador Prize and is currently nominated for the Mayor's Performing Artist of the Year Award. Daniela shares her work with galleries, artist-run centres, musical organisations and independent radio programmes throughout British Columbia in Canada. Daniela, thanks very much for joining us, and I will pass the microphone over to you now.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up? Cool.
Yeah.
Welcome, and thank you, Jacek, for inviting me to share today, and to both Jacek and Tim for including me in the Walking Festival of Sound. I congratulate you both for the success of the festival, and also congratulate the other artists involved in the festival, from whom I have learned and been inspired so much, and pleased that some of you are here today. Please let me see your faces if you're not too shy. I would love to see all of you. I would also like to thank Heather and Giorgio of Vancouver New Music for sponsoring the commissioning of surfacing. And the video would not have been possible without the creative and technical assistance of Kamloops writer and artist Corey Hope. I'm speaking with you today from Kamloops, situated on the unceded traditional territory of Tk'emlúps de Secwépemc, within Secwépemc. I am a descendant of Italian immigrants who arrived to further the resource extraction industry that harmed this land and its people. I am from the European settler tradition of music that imposed settler ideas onto Indigenous people, keeping them from furthering their traditions through their authentic artistic means. I recognize that my video surfacing is set upon silence, and that this silence is representative of removing the voices of Indigenous people through violence and genocide. My commitment is to use listening, resonating, and sound walking as ways to learn, connect with the land, and better understand the people who have cared for this place since time immemorial. And now I will share my screen. My practice of piano performance took a different direction about 5 years ago, when I had to get the hammers replaced on my piano. The novel look of my old hammers lying lifeless and disembodied on the floor of my studio gave me a different, almost visceral perspective. I realized that compared to other musical instruments, pianists and their audience rarely see the inner mechanisms of this instrument. This invited me to consider how the wood, wool, and metal resonate in their authentic environment. This curiosity inspired me to enroll in sculpture and intermedia studies at Thompson Rivers University. I was curious as to what creative endeavors could occur by inverting the innards of my instrument. The creature shown here was one of my first and purely sculptural explorations. Like my new pursuit, it is somewhat immature, but creating it became a bit of a study for using piano parts in design. During my studies at TRU, I was drawn to natural materials like wood and approached wood bending in several ways, much like instrument making, and to explore the principles of acoustics. Ironically, it was during my time as a visual arts student that I first discovered the work of Vancouver and World Soundscape Project and the practice of sound walking. Whereas most of the images I had seen of sound walking featured humans wearing plastic headsets attached to electronic devices, I was curious about how listeners wearing more gestural acoustic headsets that enhance real-time listening to local sound could promote sound walking as a kind of performance, along with the same type of responsibility held by a performer. My original sound walk with the headset was through the streets and rail yards of downtown Kamloops that held the history of where I first lived as an infant. I also led some ensemble sound walks using the headsets. I used the same downtown route to create another soundwalk activity which invited the public to access site-specific field recordings and obsolete media machine improvisations with their mobile devices accessing the QR codes found on these sound capsules. In 2021, Kamloops Art Gallery brought in the touring show Soundings, an exhibition in 5 parts curated by Candace Hopkins and Dylan Robinson. The collection by Indigenous artists posed the question, how can a score be a call or tool for decolonization? I was invited to participate in an interpretation of Raven Chacon's graphic score, American Ledger, No. 1, with members of the Kamloops Symphony Orchestra directed by Dina Gilbert. Recognizing that the piano was the most settled of all settler instruments, I created a deconstructed version using hammers and strings for my part in the performance. Here's a sample of what it sounded like. As part of Soundings, I was also invited to create an audio soundwalk as a public engagement project. This image of a reel-to-reel machine was the title photo for the project. The use of obsolete analog machines has been part of my practice because they are from my generation growing up in the 60s and 70s. In fact, my first field recordings were made with a cassette tape machine I brought to Italy as a child when visiting relatives. I have realized that there is a tension in my practice between acoustic or analog machines versus the digital field recording and audio editing skills that I've only recently developed in the past 5 years. The Kamloops Art Gallery Soundwalk was again another version of the same downtown soundwalk route. The most fun and adventurous recording of the project was spent one night between midnight and about 3 a.m. improvising on the urban surfaces stretching several blocks of the main downtown street. For the Walking Festival of Sound, I chose to redirect my sound walking route to the university campus where it was more peaceful than downtown. For weeks, I made walking through campus a daily practice of listening and choreography of the route, returning home to make sketches that subsequently became graphic scores on which to improvise future walks. Corey and I thought it would be best to film the performance in one continuous shot so that the flow would enable viewers to feel like they were walking along with me. We had one walkthrough and then many days of discussion for things like mic placement and pace before filming the single take. We decided to leave the audio completely unedited. Here are some of the sculptures I created for the interventions in surfacing. The belt made with copper-wound bass strings from a piano. The tape mass made with old music school piano recordings from the 80s. And a hand-sewn windscreen used to cover the lavalier mic on my wrist. Thank you so much for allowing me to share this video today. And I think now I'll pass it over to Tim or Jacek, and they will share the link.
can probably start our Q&A session. So since we are also not that many, I think maybe we can just pose questions directly. We can skip the chat. What do you think, Daniela? What would you prefer? And would that be fine with everyone?
Yeah, I mean, I welcome your questions with you speaking directly on the screen, but if you're shy, I don't mind if you type a question.
Great.
Hey, I think that's good, giving people the choice if they want to type it or if they want to come to the camera. It's up to the individual. Yeah.
Well, that sounds good. Since we don't have any yet, I don't see any yet, I will just start with a couple of observations. I really love your piece, Daniela, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. I'm so curious to know about your experience while filming it, and also how it felt to be at the place at such a specific moment where you don't really have any other sounds around you, and you are the one who is actually orchestrating the soundscape in a way. But I also wanted.
You're a little glitchy, but I'll go ahead and answer that question.
Sure.
So I really feel like I have a performer's instinct, just because of my training. So I really felt in the moment. I'm not a very great improviser for styles of music like jazz. So for me, it's very liberating to feel the impulse of improvisation. And I also have a hard time slowing down and regulating my flow, but I challenged myself to slow the pace, because I've learned through music and performance that if you somehow try to slow down time and listen slower, you will forget slower. But if I'm feeling rushed and perform in kind of a rushed state of time, or listen or practice in a rushed state, then I will forget faster.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I was wondering about how it felt to mobilize the instruments or devices that you built, and which come from instruments that are supposed to be kind of statically located in indoor environments, right? And I wonder what kind of criticality, what kind of critical reflections this mobilization of those devices, provoked or invoked in you. And I was really inspired by your interaction with the metronome, because for me it felt like by mobilizing it, you kind of reverse the power dynamics, right? It's usually the metronome that is mobilizing you in a very specific way, and here, by moving it in space, it started behaving according to your movement. So in a way, you became a metronome for that device, in a way, right? And I found it very fascinating, that kind of reversal of relationships between the kind of a structuring device and that which is being structured by it. I wonder if you can tell a few words about your observations from bringing those devices into space and moving with them, as opposed to being moved by them.
Right, so I guess I've been learning about myself that I'm a very kinetic person, and that there's a tension in my practice between sitting at the piano or sitting at the computer to do my creative work and moving freely on the land. And with the metronome, it was a real exploration for me to take kind of a colonial device and explore how other people may move through time and space. People who perhaps have more or less power than me, people who are more or less privileged than I am. How do people move depending on their positionality, and how does people's gait relate to their challenges, their abilities, their mobilities? And that's kind of how I felt with using the metronome in that way. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Daniela. Yes. We have a question from Helena. Go ahead, Helena. Good to see you.
Hi, Daniela, that was really gorgeous, and thank you for sharing it. And some of the imagery of the tools and instruments you were using was so striking. I actually have 3 questions, but I'll ask maybe one at a time, or see how, if anyone else's hand is flying up, to slow myself down. So the first, I think I'll start with the question that jumps off a bit more of what Jacek was saying. But I know one of the things I noticed in the walk, and I wonder if you can speak to how you thought through this, was the idea, or at least the sense from me watching it, of restraint. It felt very restrained and measured. Obviously, like, that's on the nose with the metronome, but like when you picked up the tape bundle, it reminded me obviously like of a big kelp bundle, and part of me was like, I wonder if you'll start thrashing it at some point, but that restraint was sort of in place throughout the walk, and then it did like draw focus to these little articulate micro gestures that were happening. But I'm wondering how you thought through that use of restraint.
Yeah, I think the restraint is part of my minimalist instinct, and also part of my attraction to deep listening. I suppose I was trying to portray my level of respect for the land, and trying not to create loud noises within the silence.
That makes sense. Okay, then I'll go to my next question, which is, I think, a little bit of a hard question, or maybe it's not. But in the text for the piece, you mentioned reconciliation, but I was wondering to what degree that's really the theme, or like not really the theme, but to how that sits in tension with maybe what I picked up more, less about maybe in reconciliation with Indigenous people, because that wasn't there wasn't that element in the walk, but reconciliation with the settler and the self, like the deconstructed instruments, and coming to terms with the materiality of those, even like the note paper around the tree, and whether that was maybe like the idea of reconciliation is more towards one's own history, and yeah, whether you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in my art, I try to tell my story, and I try not to impose my creativity, or gain any creativity from the stories of Indigenous people. I did do some research about that place on campus, and learned about the fact that some Indigenous people from some northern nations were kind of transferred to some small houses on campus, and one of those people is a friend. And so I talked to her about her experiences as a child, being the whole family got moved from a northern nation to one of the small houses on campus, and these houses still exist there. And listening to her stories of the sounds that she could remember on that space. And one of the sounds that she shared with me, or memories that she shared with me, was that she could see and hear horses that were kind of left to roam wildly on the field and behind their place. So although I listened to her story, and I acknowledge the past history of that space, you're absolutely correct. My practice involves more of a deconstruction of my own settler music traditions.
Thank you for answering. I'll just ask the last one because it's a smaller one and pretty quick. The visual component of the documentation I found really interesting, because you're recording the sound on your body, and then the camera is following you at a varying distance. And I was just wondering if that sort of extra uncanniness, or that maybe little bit of distance, you can come so close, but there's still a level of alienation because you're not paired with the volumes of your interactions. I was wondering if that was intentional or if it was a constraint of documentation, and whether you experimented with like a GoPro or other points of view for the visual component.
Right. So I think what Corey used was a gimbal, and I I think that's kind of like a GoPro, except you're right. The audio was being picked up by the microphone that was in my pocket, and so the only kind of planning we had around that was that Corey would maintain a similar distance to me throughout the filming, but because it was our first time and my first time doing anything like that, I think that I would like to challenge myself to do something again like that with your comments and suggestions in mind.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing it and for
Thanks, Helena.
Thank you, Helena. Tim, you raised your hand.
Yes, thanks, Daniela. It was really great to watch. Actually, it's the second time I've seen it, but it was actually a really great experience seeing it for a second time because there was lots of things I didn't notice on the first time. I really liked the episodic nature of it, where there are these different motifs that you go to in this kind of quite intriguing space. I feel like maybe each of those motifs could be a piece of work in itself, you know, especially the metronome piece or the necklace piece. But my question kind of follows on from Helena's actually in a way, which is about mediation and the choice of mediating this walk. I mean, obviously it's a convenient thing because we can all watch it and enjoy it. But I wondered, had you considered doing it as a physical walk with people present there, or was this walk always something that would be done with as a collaboration with a video maker? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this walk was felt very isolated, and I guess that reflects my experience as a solo performer at the piano. But I have done sound walks on the campus without the devices, and I am really thinking that maybe the next step is to invite a group or have an event where people could walk the campus with me or another site in Kamloops with me, using in particular the piano string belt, because it's something easy to put on and kind of it would provide a different experience for the sound walkers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it totally does. I mean, the other thing is like you can like you were doing these kind of performative interventions in that space, and they're kind of interesting to see and listen to. And I also kind of was hoping that maybe somebody would encounter you doing these kind of odd actions in this space, and then you would have this interaction. But it was kind of as you mentioned in the introduction to the work, how silent it is and silent of noise and silent of the presence of other people. So I wonder if even just doing it in a more public space or a busier space would change that work, and you wouldn't even necessarily need to invite an audience because your audience would invite themselves when they saw you, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just remember Siori and Kim's video that kind of started the Walking Festival of Sound this year. And I just imagine being in a place like Seoul or a really crowded place and having some documentation of me wearing or somebody wearing that piano string belt and dragging it across like a hugely populated area.
Mm. Yeah, great. I would like to try the piano string belt one day.
I'll try to pack it in my suitcase when I come to Newcastle.
Yeah, great. Cool. We can do a Newcastle version. Any other questions from anyone? Jacek, do you have anything?
No, I'm just checking if there's anyone on the chat. But I was thinking about similar thing, like how would it be to perform this at the kind of rush hour at the campus? You know, like because of course your instruments have this disruptive potential for you as a composer, right? Like you disrupt their their order in a way, the kind of the way that they're organized, and so there is one kind of disruption happening here. And how would it be to disrupt the situation of like a daily situation at the campus by being there with all these kind of disruptive instruments? I would also like to hear more about like what kind of potential that kind of act would have. You partially answered that, but I wonder if there is also something to it that you could think of developing a piece towards.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I'm fascinated with is chance performance and allowing different things to happen and just accepting them and kind of giving up that control as a performer. And so I would welcome that. And I actually was kind of hoping that there would be more interaction and people around, but it just so happened that that there was not much happening that morning that we chose. I would have liked more interaction with the strangers or other creatures happening upon the set.
Thank you.
Daniela, I
Hi,
wanted to.
Linda.
Hi, I loved it. And I have to tell you, everything you do, I love when you're on the piano and it's a musical, like lyrical sort of sounds. But this, to me, was a performance. I don't know if that was your intention, because to me, I felt like I went to yoga. I felt it was very meditative, and I got lost, being more present. We get so busy and you're thinking of this and that. For 25 minutes, I was hearing every little detail, and it did captivate me, like when I see you play the piano. So it was beautiful. And the only question I had was, when you're doing this, it seems like meditation, but is it a performance to you as well? Do you find it very similar, or what's happening when you're doing the whole, it's set like from beginning to end, there's no cut. You start and you end, no break.
Thanks, Linda. All of those things that you said are absolutely true and going through my mind. And I'm inspired by the words of Hildegard Westerkamp of the Vancouver Soundscape Project. This quote always sticks in my mind, and it doesn't just relate to music, but just how I try to navigate as a better person. And she says something like, to be present as a listener, no, to be in the present as a listener is a revolutionary act. So I think that is always kind of like the foundation of any work that I do. And I think I'm inspired by deep listening and being in the moment and trying to connect with my surroundings on different levels, just through being present. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I felt it. It was really, really profound. So thank you for doing that.
Are there any more questions?
Maybe a comment. Hi,
Please go ahead,
Daniela.
Marta.
Maria.
Calling from Ecuador. Yeah, it was great. It was great to see you in a different venue, completely different venue from a concert hall. As a pianist, I loved your all of your materials, and they were totally disembodied from their normal spot, and they made different music completely. There were no Western notes at all, and they became almost like just part of nature. The keys they sounded like wood. Obviously, the paper, it could have been. It's also from nature. It was around the tree that it was made from, but it had musical notes on it. It was great.
Thank you. Well, Maria is one of my oldest friends from the 80s. We went to music school together, and we spent, she's one of my pals that we each were spending 5 and 6 hours in the practice room trying to practice our art, and have really great to see you here, Maria. Thank you for your presence and your friendship.
Daniela, I was thinking about how your piece also reveals that there is perhaps not a huge difference between musical instruments and scientific instrument. Like you were in a way doing some kind of botany, like you were botanizing by you, by the means of musical instruments, and that maybe opening up different avenues through which we can experience the place. So I find your piece like an example of showing us that no instrument is objective. No instrument provides an objective insight into the world, but it's in fact not even mediating, but negotiating, perhaps very specific kind of access. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the potential of dismantling instruments of all sorts, devices, instruments, media, to bring a different perspective on a mainstream narrative or a mainstream story. How do you perceive that, and to what extent is this something important to your practice? Or to maybe frame it differently, can the act of dismantling, appropriating, repurposing colonial devices, for instance, really bring justice to what colonialism has been responsible for?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty heavy question. I'm not sure if it can bring justice. But, oh, that's a tough question. How can dismantling instruments... I think I have kind of a curiosity about our current situation and perhaps what some people may feel or view as a collapse of our civilization. And I think that deconstructing and dismantling anything from our society is kind of part of that sentiment. And I wonder, it just makes me wonder, like, kind of what traces are we leaving behind, and kind of more of an archaeological view of, how are we going to leave this place and what's happening to this place. But I'm not sure if I can answer such a complex question in such a short time. But thank you so much for inspiring me and challenging me, Jacek.
No, I'm sorry for asking such a broad one. I'm aware it's a broad one, but I mean, I find, of course, a potential. I mean, there's a lot done within, critical media studies, for instance, about how by opening up black boxes and revealing, the mechanisms and all the agencies that are involved in operating building those machines, operating, whether we talk about humans or non-humans, are often implicated in some kind of, unjust or violent relationships. So in a way, there is always potential, but I was wondering how it kind of comes across through your practice, or if you find this as a modus operandi to your work. But we don't have to go. You don't have to go there.
Thank you so much. I think I do think about all those things, but I mean, I just keep going back to my solo practice and how privileged I am to have that. And I'm just hoping to use these performative instincts to become a better person and to understand diverse narratives and diversity in others. And I just find the dismantling and the using of my kind of settler traditions hopefully more democratic. And it's just a way for me to explore a different way of being, a different way of walking on the land.
Thank you, Daniel. I think Helena has one more question.
Yeah, it actually follows the last two questions. Both the reference about botany, and then Jacek's question about the role of dismantling. And I wonder if you've thought, or if it's an interesting avenue to think through, but like in colonial cartography and in colonial history here, there is an emphasis on this idea of sampling and of taking like botanical samples out of the location and like putting them into the schematic of categories and analyzing them, and that as part of a mapping. And this felt almost like a reverse sampling, like you weren't taking artifacts out of the environment and putting them into like a cabinet and trying to put them into an like Latin order or whatever, but more the opposite, that you were like deconstructing and then resampling from your own artifacts. And so I wondered if the concept of sampling from that sort of natural sciences point of view could also maybe inform the way that the performance could be read, another way of reading that performance, and especially like sampling being a musical concept as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, your whole question about cartography and kind of like the artificial boundaries that we set upon this land. I think, you know, when we talk about cultural mapping or sound mapping, I think it's really interesting to learn about the more fluent boundaries that exist or tried to exist during colonization, of like the different overlapping boundaries of the different nations. As far as the sampling goes, I think I do have that sense when I do field recordings that I'm taking something and using that sample and then reusing it in a composition. So this was the exact opposite, and I think I kind of reflected that when I brought the metronome out of the locker. It was kind of like a way of removing it from its kind of tradition of containment or restraint. I hope that answers your question.
It really does. And with the tape bundle as well, that removing it from its container was really clear too. I kind of just like that thought of like these reverse, you're not a collector taking from, you know, this scene, but it's a more yeah, it plays into the deconstruction as well. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I kind of I'm interested in using the term or the concept of re repatriation, repatriation of the materials back to their original terrestrial resonance, repatriating obviously all of the mined and extracted materials that are used to create and mass produce all these musical instruments and machines and devices.
I felt like the sheet music around the tree was such an effective moment. It felt like I really made that connection directly in that moment, but it didn't feel heavy-handed because the eloquence of the paper and the eloquence of the tree were really strong, and I felt like that really helped me put things into that frame in a way that was powerful. And I really like that moment was one that I wrote down. I'm like, whoa, the sheet music around the tree is really beautiful and effective. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think that people have different perspectives about that sound that I created at the tree, because here in this place, we've had 2 years of absolute devastating wildfires. And some of the people who have listened to or seen kind of a preview of that moment in the surfacing video have expressed to me that they thought that the sound was like the starting of a burning forest.
Actually, that context is super important. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you, Helena, for those questions. Your question about sampling, reversal sampling, brought to my mind the piece by Mark Peter Wright, who was talking at the Walking Festival a couple of months ago. And in one of his pieces, he's decided to bring his archive of field recordings back into the environment. And so he revisited those places where he took recordings. and he played them back in the environment and then kind of eternally deleted them as an act of maybe repatriation or rematriation. And I wonder, Daniela, what's the future of those devices? Would you consider, how will you work with them in your further career? Would you consider kind of disposing them of in the environment, or will they become part of some other kind of process? And also, how does this particular piece affect your practice as a pianist, for instance, as a more quote-unquote conventional, musician, so to speak?
Yeah, so to your first comment about what happens to all of these machines and instrument parts, I mean, it's pretty obvious that if we think that we're throwing anything away, it never really goes away. So I think that, like, I look at the amount of storage space in my home that is dedicated to storing musical instruments, and I also wonder if that storing musical instruments and artworks. And I'm really grateful that most of my work and most of the instruments are acoustic instruments. They're made out of wood and metal and fibers, so hopefully that can somehow go back to the land at one point. And the second question, sorry, what was your second question?
The second one was about how this practice, this experimental kind of engagement with those instruments and environment affect your musical, I call it conventional, but that's maybe a wrong word, but you know what I mean, like more traditional approach to instruments that you engage as an educator and teacher, so, for example.
Yeah, I think it actually affects my teaching more than anything else. With this kind of sound walking work and tuning myself into listening more, I find that I'm a more patient listener with my students. And I allow things to happen within the moment of teaching a lot more. And whereas I used to kind of jump in to correct my students, now I kind of enjoy just sitting back and standing back and allowing my students to kind of figure out what to do more on their own. So perhaps I feel a little bit more organic as a teacher, and I hope that will make me more organic of a player. Playing the piano has always been a huge struggle for me. So I think that kind of taking a step in another direction is hopefully going to help me as a pianist as well. And but the one thing I notice as I kind of resist the opportunities to perform in a traditional way, it's because I feel like I'm trapping the listener and that I'm kind of pushing around the sound and kind of forcing them to listen to something. Whereas this kind of work and sound walking is a little bit more democratic, and I'm not kind of forcing a sound or pushing around the listener.
Thank you, Daniela. All right, if there are no more questions, I thought of wrapping up. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and insight into your process. I think we all learned a great deal today, and we'll follow your work. I wanted to say a few words about the festival as it continues. As I mentioned at the beginning, this year's format is slightly different than normally. We started in June, more or less, and we'll go on till December with events of all kinds, kind of distributed over time. So maybe Daniela, would you like to say a few words about the Kamloops Cultural Days event, which was also part of the festival that happened just recently, right?
Right. So I was really happy that that the curators of Walking Festival of Sound and the artists released their work so that I could share it in Kamloops in the Round Theatre, which is my video was filmed right outside of that Round Theatre, so I originally thought it would be really cool to kind of reinvert the sound to an interior space, and I was really glad that I was able to show 10 to 12 pieces from the Walking Festival of Sound on the large screens and the surround sound speaker system there. So that was great, and I was glad to share that with about 30 people who ended up coming that night. So it was great to have the highlights here in Kamloops. It was almost like the festival had a little bit of a voice here.
Yeah, that's great. I heard some. Yeah, you channeled some good reflections, interesting reflections from the audience. Thank you, Daniela, for facilitating that. And when it comes to other events, I don't know if you can see now the list of commissioned artists for this year's festival. And recently we had premiere. In fact, today, Cha Mie, another artist from Korea, is presenting their work Sound, Picture and Mirror in Korea as a form of few-day workshop. We don't have, unfortunately, Sei-hee Sean with us, who is a curator of the Korean part of the festival, and she will have more information about Cha Mie's piece. But I can leave a link to a piece which is now being uploaded on our YouTube channel, and you are welcome to see it. It's a world premiere starting today, and the piece will be available for a month. It's an audiovisual meditation of soundscapes in selected locations in Korea. And in late August, we had facilitated a listening session similar to the one that Daniela facilitated in Kamloops, but that one was taking place in Roberts Creek, which is a small town on Sunshine Coast in British Columbia. And we had the same set of pieces that were presented in Kamloops and in Newcastle. Tim will hopefully feed us with some more info about how that went. It was a beautiful setting, utilizing resonators built by Georgia Magnanenzi, one of the co-curators of this year's edition and composer based in Roberts Creek. So the audience was exposed to this ongoing kind of rotating list of pieces, which were basically filling in the soundscapes of the forest, of the rainforest. There's a documentation also on our channel. I will send the link in a second. One more piece which I would like to bring attention to is this piece by fellow Daphne Plesner called Deer Tour. The piece has been developed outside of the framework of the festival, but it has been it kind of became part of the festival, and it's a set of audio guided journeys or podcasts that reflect on kind of colonial and indigenous relation to deer. You will find more information also on our website, and I will leave a link in the chat. And one more piece that has been premiered recently within the festival is Sante Jean's piece E7L, which was a collaboration with me. Sante was situated in a theater in Korea, in Seoul, performing to a soundwalk that I pre-recorded in Vancouver by walking and capturing soundscapes of kind of canonic sound marks, but kind of revealing other stories behind those canonic sound marks. You're also welcome to check out this video. There is a documentation from the entire performance and a shorter version of that piece. Tim, would you like to say a few words about the listening situation in Newcastle?
Yes, sure. So to accompany all of this, we had also kindly the artists allowed us to play their work in the listening space that I'm curating in Newcastle upon Tyne, which is in the northeast of England. And this is an old Georgian building with a kind of quite ornate archway, and within this we're lucky to have 4 speakers, and it's kind of an outdoor-indoor space, so there's people moving through it all of the time, 24/7. And yeah, we played some of the works from artists involved in the festival on this sound system, which had a great reception from different people, and only one complaint. So if it's just one complaint, I think that's a success. So yeah, there's documentation of this coming, will be on the YouTube channel in the next few weeks, I imagine.
Thanks, Tim.
Great. No worries.
Yes, so on that note, here I posted the link, so you can find all these videos I mentioned in our YouTube channel, and please follow us on Twitter and on our website for the upcoming events. As I said, we will continue till the end of December. There will be a couple more events and premieres. And I would like to also thank everyone involved in this year's edition: Tim Shaw, Georgia Magnanenzi, Heather McDermott, and Seihi Shon, who formed this year's curatorial team, and Daniela, of course, who also stepped in with her initiative in Kamloops. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight, and please stay with us for more.
Thanks, Jacek. Thanks, Daniela. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.